Okay, Minister Eriksen Søreide, I would say that first, as a way of proceeding, multilateralism, used to be more internationalized, right? So now it's more regionalized, and in our neighborhood, we feel this very strongly. So in this week, for example, like tomorrow morning, Secretary Pompeo will give a big speech, I think, on the Indo-Pacific strategy. China has been peddling, promoting the Belt and Road Initiative. So we're seeing multilateralism not like it used to be, more regionalized. Let me come to Dr. Kantathi and His Excellency Kasit Piromya. Both of them used to be foreign ministers of Thailand at different times, of course. Dr. Kantathi back in 2005-06. There's a life, there's a very professorial life. After being foreign minister, he has been in recent years a professor at the University of California in Los Angeles, where he earned his Bachelor's of Arts degree in political science. Dr. Kantathi earned his PhD from the USC, University of Southern California. But he's also involved in private business, family business. He was a director of the Bangkok Post, and many other positions you can see from his bio. He was our 39th foreign minister. So we've had a lot of cabinet changes over the years. But Dr. Kantathi, maybe you can sort of follow up multilateralism, and you've taught courses on international law, diplomacy, international cooperation. Where are we going with this? I mean, we can think, we can wish, as the minister said, the world as we would like it to be is very much different than the world as it is. Where is it going, and how can we kind of reshape and refashion it so that it can still be a kind of world that we would like to see?
Thank you very much. Such an honor and pleasure to be here in this grand university, #1 in Thailand, and to be, of course, with my dear friend, colleague, and now Kasit, and of course with Minister of Foreign Affairs from Norway, former defense minister too. Very comprehensive look at the international system, and I appreciate, first of all, your presentation. I think we are absolutely in a very delicate situation now, but multilateralism has to continue. But before we look at the future, I want to just take a quick step back to the past. And when we look at the past, actually we're going back quite far, back to 1648. And that to me was the birth of more or less the modern sovereign state idea, the Peace of Westphalia. So there we really had nationalism, we had complete sovereignty, remember the important principle of non-interference in the internal affairs, regardless of what reasons. That was embedded in 1648, and then throughout the years have been trying to move away from that situation. So that situation was a state-centric situation in which self-help would be the rule, an international system of anarchy, unpredictability, no community police force. It was chaotic and very, very scary. And so there were movements towards what I would say away from the strict consent under international law. Now, consent under international law probably would be something embedded even in the statute of the International Court of Justice. No state can be taken to the ICJ without specific permission each time. So can you imagine what would happen in a national society? The law wouldn't function. So with that feeling of insecurity, there was a movement towards multilateralism, which started way back. And that was actually to move us away from the consent of each state to maybe an international consensus on decision making. The US was at the forefront, came up with the so-called compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, meaning that a member state can actually declare in advance that it would accept the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice for maybe 10 years or more, depending on itself, recognizing the principle of reciprocity that the other state in question would have had to declare the same. So that took away the need to get consent every time. The US was the leader in this, but then within the US itself, when it came out with this compulsory jurisdiction declaration, it had a small kind of problem within it, and it was called the Connolly Amendment, which was adopted together with this move forward towards multilateralism and consensus building. And that the Connolly Amendment stated that the U.S. Would not be subject to the International Court of Justice jurisdiction if the question at hand had to do with domestic jurisdiction of the U.S. and the key problem, as determined by the U.S. So then we went straight back to the beginning. The U.S. can determine anything to be under its own domestic jurisdiction and would not go to court. So we already had this move towards multilateralism and then away from it to a degree. At the heart of multilateralism, to me, would be international institutions. And the core international institution is the UN, and as you've mentioned, now the WTO and others. We have, throughout the years, seen a movement towards integration and then steps backwards towards fragmentation throughout the years. So we haven't had a smooth transition from state-centric, sovereign-centric to real multilateralism, but steps back and then back and forth. So to the degree that a distinguished professor of international relations in the US called James N. Rosenau observed and in the 70s described the situation in the world as fragmigration, meaning that we're moving towards fragmentation and integration at the same time. And what we are seeing today from my perspective is that we are doing the same. So I still have hope for multilateralism because we have had some setbacks, but we've had many setbacks before too. And then we have steps forward. But now, just imagine a world without multilateralism, a world without international institutions. Remember the Universal Postal Union, which was formed many years ago, but now is part of the UN Specialized Agency. Now that controls how the mail that we send around the world is regulated. In other words, you can put Thai stamps on and then just send it to any destination, and that's it. But without this organization, each country will have to negotiate bilaterally with all countries in the world. And then if we are sending maybe a package from Thailand to maybe Germany, each country that the package goes through will require postal stamps. And so you will have to have postal stamps from all these countries when you mail one letter. But the convenience of international organization, multilateralism, is that everything goes through there's an agreement among us. So with that, I would then come to the other conclusion that we do need to reform the international institutions that we have now. What has happened in the past few years has been the increasing distance between international institutions and the people that it was supposed to serve. The general people on the streets, the ordinary people, that's been detached to a degree. So that has to be changed, and one way would be to get civil societies and NGOs more involved in decision-makings of international organizations. That has been the major complaints which led to the creation and the ability of nationalists to gain track in that. Only the liberal elites are benefiting from multilateralism, not the ordinary people. We have to change that somehow. And of course, migration is a major problem. And when countries are forced, like in the European Union, some countries were forced to open up their borders, some voluntarily, some were forced, and that led to reaction too. So the nationalistic reaction, the nationalists were scaring people with all these problems with international institutions and the limit of sovereignty. So you have that backlash. So I think this frank migration situation will continue, and we have to do our best to fix the international system, but not to discard multilateralism. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We also used to think that we have found the solution to the problems of the world, right? In terms of after the Second World War, if you come up with the right kind of institutions, rules, and laws and norms, you don't have to have any more world wars. But now I think that kind of linear view has subsided. Let me pick up on three words you mentioned, Dr. Kantathi. Leadership, inequality, and reform. And then before I pass over to His Excellency Kasit Piromya. There is multilateralism. It is led. So the question is, who leads it? Who leads? So far, the system that we have is US-led. But the US has other ideas now. And this is a problem that we have, is a kind of leadership, what kind of multilateralism, who leads, under what terms, whose rules. And we have inequality, it's a cliche, but there's inequality within societies, across societies, but there's a big inequality in the international system that requires some kind of recalibration and reform. So I'll give you an example, the IMF, right? So now they need a new IMF managing director. It will not be an Asian. It will be a French person. It always has been. And the World Bank's always been American-led. So there's a perceived unequalness here between, let's say, US and China. So China probably would think, why should the US play the leading role, in everything, right? So this is, I think, where we can kind of see what we need to do. The system has to be reformed. The UN system, the WTO, IMF, World Bank. It has to be more equal. There are different new players, major players around here, Indonesia, ASEAN countries, China, India, you name it. But it's not happening. And that's where we have our dilemma and predicament.ท่านทูตกสิทธิ์ครับ your word from you, anything that you react to, say, please feel free.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I was one time Director General of the International Organization Department of the Foreign Office. So I do remain firmly, strongly a multilateral man in that sense. So do rest assured that I will do whatever I can in order to promote multilateralism. That's one point. Second, thank you very much, Foreign Minister Ine, for the summary of your white paper, and especially for the clarity of the policy direction and the measures that could be undertaken by the international community to enhance and to revitalize multilateralism. That clarity is very important indeed during the monsoon months in Thailand, because we don't have much clarity here in Thailand or in the ASEAN community. But I like the spirit of a small country like Norway trying to get the lead and trying to asking everyone to join in the effort, to shore up multilateralism. And one particular point that touched me very much is the fact that now you are discarding this one principle of penalizing and punishing certain countries because they happen to have certain policy measures that are not conducive to the liberal, open Norwegian society. You mentioned the death penalty, and I think that has been one of the hindrances of bilateral, regional, multilateral cooperation, because a lot of European countries, democratic liberal ones, refuse to work with other countries simply because there happened to be an accident on the street of Bangkok at the coup d'etat. But I think the fundamentals and the wish of the people in general are still with democracy and so on. So that period somehow it, distance. But with that change of mind, I think I most welcome. And do search for democratic forces in each of the countries, even in Hong Kong or in mainland China and so on. So that's a welcoming thing. What I would like to add is this, that one should not be disheartened and deterred by the failure of the World Trade Organization and the rising of the expansion of the bilateral free trade agreements. So there's an impasse at the WTO. But it doesn't mean that at the UN body in general, UNDP in particular, or at ECOSOC, or even at the World Bank or the IMF, that we cannot go on pursuing multilateral cooperation. I think that's very important. And I think nationalism, populism, and Donald Trump and similar things, I think it would not be in the long-term basis. I think it's an aberration of the domestic politics and so on. But in that sense, then smaller countries would have to work together. That spirit of cooperation is very, very important. And so we have to set our mind that smaller countries, less contribution to the UN at large, to the World Bank, IMF, and so on. But if we work together collectively, I think our percentage contribution would become quite substantial. And in that sense, we have to move across the regional confine. So could we have that cooperation across region, and then we add our percentage contribution, and then we push for more participation, more directorships, and so on. In the various regional and international organizations. And I could say this if there are some of the Japanese diplomats here. It's about time that the Director General of Asian Development Bank should be a non-Japanese. Why not? I think that would be a great contribution of the Japanese government to the community at large. And at the end of the day, then you have the one belt, one road, and so on, because the Chinese, they feel that they have been kept out, and so on. So that's one other point. But my point is smaller countries should get together. And I think the UN, both in New York and Geneva, could do that. I recall sometime, about 10 years ago, there were 6 or 7 countries, I think either Sweden or Norway, South Africa, Thailand, Indonesia, and Brazil, and so on, were working together on the development cooperation, I think pertaining to poverty alleviation and to the food and so on. And then that somehow disappeared 10 years back and so on. But it was an attempt at that time for smaller countries to work together. And beside the G8 and then later G20, there was also at one time G24. So why not we try to work together on some common issues? And I would use the word cross-border issues, climate change, international crimes, and all that, and let it be the initiative and the joint efforts of the smaller countries, to work so we can have a list of things that we can do together. I think Norway is working a lot with the ASEAN community on the maritime affairs. And we have the plastics, the size of the plastic floating in the oceans, about the size of Thailand. So can we work on that one together? And then we push at the WTO, World Bank, FAO, and so on. And so we list certain subjects, and the smaller countries work together. We don't have to wait for the big brothers. That's one point. Second, can we pull the resources together? It's always waiting for the development assistance forthcoming from Japan, from the EU as a whole, and the bigger donors like Germany, France, and England, and the United States, of course. But why not we just forget all of this country, and then we pull the resources together? And we could speak to the Brunei Sultanate and so on, that they have so much money. The Gulf states, so much money and so on. Why not they come and work together with the fellow smaller countries in order to push multilateralism with specific subjects that we could work together. And at the same time, I think UNDP should be the overall coordinator and can work with certain consortium and so on. And I think one of the other point is that I think maybe Norway also, your development assistance, you always have this earmarked principle. So 60-70% of your development assistance is according to your wish, but not the wish of the international community or of the recipient. Can we make it that 50-50? So that what is being earmarked, okay, you do it for your own name, fame, and so on, and you can explain this to the parliament. But the other 50% of your development is then make it flexible. And then you can work with Norway and other fellow like-minded smaller countries to work on the sea, marine resources, pollution, and so on, coastal area. And even to basic things that we have a move on to do away with all the plastic bag, the plastic straws when you drink and so on, and turn everything as much as green as possible. So a few points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Captain Kasit. I'll come back to Minister Eriksen Søreide in a second. To say that the point about small countries working together is a critical one for us around here as small countries. When multilateralism becomes problematic, small countries suffer the most. But it's not easy. I think also the middle powers also having a hard time grappling with there's a superpower rivalry and competition between the US and China. I'll add this to the mix. It's ironic these days that the big countries talking about multilateralism and international cooperation is China. I think Foreign Minister Wang Yi's speeches over the last couple of days, he's the one talking about multilateralism, not the US anymore. And this is something that we haven't seen before. It's very alarming. So let me come back to you, Foreign Minister Eriksen Søreide. The US and China, this is really the big backdrop. All the meetings here overshadowed by US and China rivalry. The Chinese, I saw news shows on the TV, CGTN, they're very aggressive, very assertive, pushing back against the US. Indo-Pacific is a containment policy for how they see it from Beijing. And Indo-Pacific from the US, they see BRI as a kind of a grand effort to supplant US leadership in the world. This is not good for multilateralism. So I think the question is becoming like, whose multilateralism? Is it Chinese multilateralism, or is it still the American-led multilateralism? And as small countries like Norway or Thailand, can we do anything to make a difference?
Well, thank you for good question, and also very interesting interventions from, I was almost going to say my former colleagues, but that was maybe not the right expression. It was very interesting to hear your insights, and I have a couple of comments to them also, if I may, but just to answer your question, you raised it a bit earlier on. You say, who leads the multilateral system? And that's actually part of the analysis we did as well, that does it matter who leads the world order? Does it matter who leads multilateralism? Yes, it does. And even though countries, it could be China and others, are stepping up and talking more about multilateralism now, are we sure that multilateralism in that sense is the same multilateralism based on the same values, the same principles, the same norms as we're used to? Not necessarily. And one of the things that I find striking with the work that we do in the UN now, be it on human rights, on sexual and reproductive health rights or other issues, is that a very prominent feature in how many countries are working in the UN now is that they are, in a way, working within the multilateral system. But what they are doing is trying to change the language in a way that weakens, for instance, rights. So yes, they are part of the multilateral system, they work within the system, but in a way that doesn't exactly lead to strengthening of the system as we see it. So yes, it does matter, and that is also why I think that countries that are like-minded, but also countries that are not like-minded in other areas, should be working closer together to focus on some of these issues. That we have seen over the past, I would say, 3 to 4 years, that we have new countries, especially in Latin America, who are now more progressive on women's rights than they were before. That's a new thing. And even though they still have a way to go in many areas, it should not prevent us from cooperating with them where we can actually make progress, or in this case, hinder that we are sliding backwards into a situation where rights that we have obtained suddenly are gone. And that is also why I think that, to your point on how we, discarding the principle of punishing countries, well, we have never had a principle in a way of punishing countries necessarily, but we have been very keen on focusing on some human rights issues that are very important to us and to others, and we do that but still cooperating with countries on other issues. And I think that's the way we need to move forward as well. If I may, I would just like to add a couple of comments that I think could illustrate the issue of multilateralism today in a way. We have to remember that the structure we are talking about now, the UN, the WTO, as the two most prominent examples, they were built on the ruins of 2 devastating world wars. Because the world realized that that everyone had to cooperate, that was a better choice than fighting a war. They had to trade with each other, and they found out that that was a better way of doing it. Those challenges are still there. They're not smaller today than they were 70 years ago, 75 years ago. Of course, they take new shapes and forms. I suppose it's a bit of a difference now than it was, but the principle is still the same. And the reason for cooperating is still the same. And that's what we need to focus on. We are, as you know, we're running for a seat in the Security Council in 21 to 22. One of the things that has been quite striking is how, when we discuss with several countries, that they see that we have been doing things consistently for many, many years. We have not invented a new policy right now, which means that for better or worse, countries know that we have a human rights record, that we always push, an agenda that we always push, but we've always been a consistent partner of the UN also. So why should a small country like Norway try to enter into the Security Council? And this is where multilateralism of today is quite interesting, I think. What we have seen other small countries like Sweden, who has just recently been in the Security Council, have managed to do is that when the multilateral system, in a way, is in a deadlock, where the Security Council sometimes is unable to find solutions because the P5 has their agenda, they do not want to move, and things can seem very, very locked. Then the elected 10 members have now a more prominent role because they have been able to work together to, in a way, circumvent the veto powers. I think it is a fascinating development. Of course, something that is not a given, we have to work with it, but I think it also illustrates that multilateralism no more is not the answer. More multilateralism is the answer, as you pointed to. We're working also in the WTO with the development dimension, which has been in a deadlock for many, many years since the Doha round. And that is also an example of that. Marine litter is also an issue where we work together with ASEAN countries and others, both through the World Bank and through development aid. One feature of development aid, which I also find fascinating now, is that we channel more and more of our funds through the bigger multilateral funds and programs. Less and less direct bilateral support. And that is exactly to your point about the priorities of the countries we're supporting. It matters. It has to matter, because that's the only way a country can take ownership for its own development, is to focus on areas that are important. And then just lastly, one fun fact to your point about the Universal Postal Union. Last week, there was a voting on taking up new members. And believe it or not, but you have to submit your vote by post. It's actually true. So we, Norway and other countries, had to submit our votes through a letter in the end of last week. So they are keeping, of course, also, they're keeping their organization alive in a good way. But I think your example is excellent on the fact that what would communications and post be without the Universal Postal Union and the agreements that everyone has made?
Thank you. Let me now open the floor, turn to the audience. If you have any questions, comments, we'll come back to the two discussants and then the minister again. But if you have any questions or comments, we can take them at this time.
Let me correct myself. I think what I mentioned about 6-7 countries at UN is the foreign policy and global health, not development assistance. I've been corrected by my colleague from the Foreign Office. Thank you. That's
okay, good correction.
But the health is something that this multilateral thing that could work. Thank you.
Questions, comments? The floor is open. Otherwise, I'll come back to our two discussants. The postal system. So in the international system, you have a kind of a civil society in a way, and then there's a whole philosophy theory about international society. So some things still work. There's a minimum kind of cushion, telecoms as well. But in fact, now in our world, there are more means for cooperation, but we're seeing not more, but a little bit less of it. The technology enables us to do a lot more. But in fact, we have borders came down, now borders are going up. This is the 30th anniversary of the coming down. But now we have the China Great Firewall. We have the Trump wall. So we're going back to the past a bit. This is something that should not be, because the technologies actually allow us to do much more international cooperation. I'm concerned with multilateralism. I'm not going to turn over to Professor Kantathi now. I'll call you Professor now, because you spoke like a professor. You should come teach here when you're not in the US. The concern with multilateralism is that its best days are past us. And we are trying to salvage what is left. But there's very little that we can do, if you look at the US and China.
Well, first of all, I feel that my example going back to history, I think to me suggests that the best days of multilateralism may not have passed, because it's always going back and forth. There's always contradictions, but we have to be smart about it. I think the point about smaller countries working together is important. We have to do that, and we have to do it across the different regions in the world. So it has to be a global alliance, so to speak. But in addition to that, we have to, at the same time, work with the larger ones. And it's not one thing before another, but it's everything at the same time. It's an irony that you mentioned, of course, the Chinese now trying to be a champion of multilateralism. In fact, they started doing that when Trump was condemning globalization. China defended globalization. So in a sense, it points to the fact that when we mention that we have to give up our national interests in order to satisfy the international interests, I would suggest that maybe it's not giving up. Maybe we're giving up the narrow perception of national interests, and by coming to help build international institutions, we are actually serving the community, the world community, as well as our own enlightened, more or less, broader national interests. So it comes back, and that's why we're in ASEAN, because it's, or even the European Union, and countries think that they are actually serving their national interest to be, and the UK felt otherwise, and so it's leading. So that's another aspect that we should try to see, that by working for the whole, we're actually helping us. But with the Chinese situation, I think we are in for more turbulence. Trump is unpredictable, except for certain things. Unfortunately, it becomes a bit predictable, and it worries me a bit, because a lot of the things that he has done has seemed to be a bit random. You know, you wake up in the morning and you watch Fox News, and then you have a reaction. But there's a consistency that is kind of disturbing in a sense. The consistency is that he's trying to undermine the liberal international order. He's trying to undermine the US alliance with the European partners. He's undermining NATO. He's undermining international institutions, and the Paris Accord, of course, and others. Many of these things that he is doing to undermine the system and undermining the strength of the US itself these things are consistent with the desires beyond the wildest dreams of the Kremlin. And that's kind of scary to me. You know, so he's been he's been unpredictable about relationships with other leaders in the world, except for two. And that is President Putin, and then you have Saudi Arabia. So it's interesting, but I think the leadership of the multilateralism is important, but countries can take turns. And it's noteworthy that having pulled out of the TPP, the US, and having pulled out of the Paris Accords, no other countries have followed that example. In fact, the PPP is moving ahead, and Thailand is looking forward to possibly joining the new vitalized TPP. So there's again that going back and forth, and I still have a degree of optimism with multilateralism, as long as we are smart about it and take care of the ordinary people and not leaving them behind.
Thank you for organizing this the seminar or discussion on a topic that is so important. And I think that the mere fact that you organize this discussion and bring up these issues, I think is already achieving a goal. And I think that I fully agree with you, your analysis on the sort of the threats to the multilateral system and the need for us, all of us who are
defendants of multilateralism to remind ourselves and everybody around us of the benefits of the multilateral system. I think that this really is our responsibility. I think it was a wonderful example, the International Postal Union. You know, when we think of citizens who, as Foreign Minister Eriksen Søreide said, people around the world with the rise of populism are they might be also behind that the distrust in institutions. So that to rebuild that trust in the institutions and in the multilateral institutions, I think it is so important that we keep reminding of what the UN, for instance, has done to every single citizen. When we think of not only how post or postal issues or aviation issues function, but when we think of the WHO and the eradication of so many diseases or so many things that are directly relevant to the individual. Equality laws in most of our countries are based on the things that we agreed at the UN or so forth. And I wouldn't even dare to think of a world without the UN Charter or without the International Court of Justice or Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. I don't even want to go there. I think that how this dispute would have been resolved without those institutions. So I think that one extremely important thing is to keep reminding about these achievements. And I think the SDGs have been a wonderful example. They have been brought directly to the individuals. It has been, I think, a wonderful success in this respect. But of course then, all of you, I think, mentioned that the need for reform at the same time and for the institutions to respond to the needs of the constantly changing world. And there I would like to ask you, what do you think are the most important reforms, let's say with the UN? What is it that needs to be reformed and how it can be reformed? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador too. So, good questions. Let's talk about concrete reforms. And let me add to that. I want to turn to Tantu Kasit. You were the Foreign Minister of Thailand. So now let me turn a little bit to multilateralism here. We'll come back to the reforms. Multilateralism in Southeast Asia based and also Thailand. There are a bunch of meetings this week. 10 years ago when Thailand chaired ASEAN, you were the Foreign Minister. Is ASEAN doing a good job being a platform and broker of multilateralism? With the ASEAN-led architecture, we know ASEAN has been successful in drawing in all these sectoral partners, ASEAN +1, dialogue partners and so on. Or is ASEAN being eclipsed now with the Indo-Pacific strategy, BRI, US-China?
Before answering that, may I say two sentences. First is that a small nation needs multilateral framework. And it has been proven many times at the United Nations when the ASEAN get together. We have a voice, we have a standing, we push things. Second is that to negotiate on the US-Thailand FTA, there is no match. We will be slaughtered, overwhelmed by the United States. We need multilateral framework like the WTO. That is the reality of things because the demand of the United States is strong. That's why. To answer your question, I think ASEAN has two words, ASEAN centrality and ASEAN people centered. And that needs political will, collective leadership, and some sort of a vision and so on. And so far that has been, all of these have not been forthcoming. It's a big disappointment at the moment with the collective ASEAN leadership. And each one of them has to wear two hats, one for their own national interest, the other one for the common multilateral or regional interest. But I think the past few years, many of the ASEAN leaders have been looking after their own self-national interests to the detriment and to the weakening of ASEAN. It's not that the Chinese or the Americans have so much power to influence. They can do up to a point, but they cannot do any more unless and until the 10 ASEAN leaders could come and work collectively. Okay. Now to your Madam Ambassador question on the UN reform, we don't have to go back much because so many working groups has been created to reform the UN. One was, I think, being chaired by the former Prime Minister of Thailand, Kun Anand Panyarachun. And that has to do with this, how many permanent members. It has to be expanded from 5 to another 5, make it much more flexible and so on. I think that would be one. Second, you have to do with this, to readjust the contribution and so on. You have to allow the Chinese to pay more. They must pay more because they are the second biggest economy and so on. And then you adjust everything accordingly. And I think regional organization, you know, ASEAN or a lot of regional organizations in Latin America, in Africa, they should have a sort of a collective voice and collective contribution so that they can have more positions and, you know, more say in the affairs of the various multilateral institutions and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So P5, permanent membership and contributions, and maybe regional organizations having a collective voice. We'll leave you to the end, if you could just read a little bit. Dr. Kantathi, if you could look at the kind of concrete reforms we need. I think that is a consensus that the international system needs to be reformed, there's no doubt. UN, IMF, World Bank, WTO, and so on and so on. It's been 7 decades, and I think the system has kind of run its course. It needs to be reinvented, relaunched, and people are unhappy with it. That's why it doesn't work so well now. So if you think about the reforms that are concrete and needed, apart from the permanent membership, contributions, regional organizations having more of a say, anything else that would come to your mind? Top 3?
Well, the problem with the reform process is that it's so slow. It's been going on and on and on. So I think the first thing is to reform the reform process somehow. So there's something wrong with it because it seems like they meet and they talk and then nothing comes out. So how do we reform them somehow to make them more effective? But there's so many different contradictions. We talked about the addition to the Perm 5, whether there should be more permanent members, and then the other question is, should the new permanent members have a veto power or not, and whether the veto power has to stay. Ideally, it shouldn't stay, but realistically, the UN would probably not function without it because it would be irrelevant. Countries would ignore it. Look at the Iraq war. You know, in the Iran, the Gulf War, it was an interesting phenomenon because the charter requires the UN Security Council to be the one to actually assign forces to enforce resolutions of the Security Council. In the Gulf War, it was the first time that I remember that the Security Council did not take charge, but delegated that power to member states by saying that member states can use all necessary means to eject Kuwait out of Iraq out of Kuwait. That's taking away its responsibility already, but then that's still approved. And another point that comes to mind with that is that even major powers require international institutions because it legitimizes their actions. And that's why U.S. behavior in Iraq, the Iraq war, subsequent to the Gulf War, did not get that approval. And so the role of international institutions in legitimizing state actions, large or small, continues to be important. With the reform process, there's another contradiction. We have the promotion of democracies around the world, which is a good thing. But is it good to promote democracy within the decision-making system of international organizations? Because if you democratize the UN, or not only the UN, but other international organizations' decision-making system, then certain countries, certain powerful countries will feel that they will be outvoted. So democracy there may backfire and make these institutions less relevant to major powers. So you have so many different aspects that sometimes contradict one another that you have to take care of. And so it seems that the reform committee needs a firm deadline and should not be allowed to continue forever. It is a difficult subject. It's something that we probably wouldn't be able to resolve here in this great university, but we have to make sure that they have deadlines, they have concrete proposals, and look at all the different contradictions and how to resolve that. But the other key things would be the relevance to the general public, the ordinary man. For ASEAN, we face the same problem. We have the wide gap between ASEAN citizens and ASEAN officials. I remember that walking the streets of Bangkok, when we talk about ARF, people thought it was going to be some kind of a sports game. It's still, there's still a big gap between the ASEAN general public. I tried to promote people-centric ASEAN when I was in office, and that's continued to be promoted. One concrete thing that I actually tried to get going was the fact that ASEAN countries should help the citizens, ASEAN embassies in foreign countries. When we don't have full ASEAN presence in that country, certain other ASEAN countries can help citizens from countries without an embassy. And I proposed that to the president of the Philippines because we have a concrete situation in which in Lebanon there was a conflict and Thai workers were being hurt, but no Thai representative on the spot in Lebanon. So we asked the Philippines to take care of the Thais. Concrete developments like that benefits the people will bring attention to the general public to see how useful international organizations are. I think the same problem with the European Union. It became divorced from the general public also. And so they began to see things in black and white. Being in the EU, to the UK, general public, some of them meant open borders, a threat to them, and also lack of sovereignty or limited sovereignty. So all these questions are so difficult to resolve that we have to work closely on.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. The reforming international institutions is such a cliche. So from what you said, the need to reform the need to reform the reform process itself testifies to and reinforces the need to reform. Right?
But I do think that the key, one of the key points was the minister's whole how you framed the issue of multilateralism versus an increasing tendency towards bilateralism or even unilateralism. But what I'd like to ask is actually this growing phenomenon now of what you might call mini-lateralism, or, as it was called in a conference this week at ASEAN Week here at Chula, plurilateralism, can't even pronounce it. And in particular, the way it can be both constructive and destructive or perhaps disruptive, as we've seen recently with all the reports recently of Cambodia's alleged secret deals with China to have a military base, which kind of would undermine the whole ASEAN centrality problem. That's a bilateral issue. But with Europe, we've seen France call for a trilateral kind of alliance with India and Australia extraordinarily. And we're also seeing things like Japan and China making a deal last year for third country cooperation on infrastructure in Asia, whereas we've got very different dynamics between Japan and China in the broader multilateral arena. So perhaps the Minister and any other panellists have thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. That kind of lateralism, by the way, is what ASEAN is good at. Mini, pluri, but multilateralism is therefore nuanced. It has different modalities, and I think there's some innovations in our neighborhood to try to have different kinds of lateralism. So that's one question for you, Minister. This will be the last question, the last round. You have the last word. From what we've heard so far in the discussion, and I'll come to Norway as the last question. What's alarming is that when workable international systems are set up after major conflict. So, is it the case that we need? Is it the case that we need? Is it the case that there has to be some kind of a international cleansing in order to get some kind of a new slate? Otherwise, we have this accumulating baggage that that slows the reform process, makes it inert and intractable. Norway, as a country in Schengen, not EU, in NATO, so it's a kind of a unique country in a certain location. So if you were looking at reforms, 1, 2, 3, with a magic wand, you can make it happen, what would these be?
Well, that's a very difficult and big question to ask at the end of a panel. But I would just like to pick up a bit on what you asked about minilateralism or plurilateralism, which is a hopeless word, and I use it as rarely as I can, but still it is a word. I think that we have to be open for the fact that countries, even though they are part of alliances, also will seek other alliances at some point in order to either enhance their own positions, but also to take care of global interests that are important to them. But I think the guiding principle, for instance, when we now look at the WTO, which I think is a very good example, the consensus principle in the WTO has, I think, effectively hindered any outcome from the Doha round in 2001. Nothing has happened, and it's still at a stalemate, nothing is moving. One of the big issues, of course, is the principle of self-declaration of countries, whether or not you're a developing country or not. And of course, there are some who think that it's not fair that China and South Korea are developing countries, declared as that, and by that have stronger rights and less obligations than others. We have tried to take the approach through a paper we delivered to WTO in May that was well received as well, that instead of continuing to have the discussion on self-declaration and what kind of category you are in, we should try to turn the discussion around and instead talk about what you can contribute. Because also developing countries can in some instances contribute more on certain areas. And that could be a way of unlocking a discussion that is completely deadlocked and has been so for many, many years. I also think, as a guiding principle, when it comes to plurilateralism or minilateralism in the WTO, that it has to be openness about an initiative, and it has to be open for everyone to join if certain member states decide to go forward with an initiative. One example right now is that 78 countries have decided to move forward with e-commerce, which is a very new and interesting initiative. We risk, if this hadn't happened, we would have risked that e-commerce would be finished, negotiated in 20 or 30 years' time, and it would be absolutely irrelevant. So moving forward, but having it open for everyone is actually very, very important. To the questions about the UN reforms, I fully agree with everything that has been said, but I would like to add one thing on a more kind of general basis when it comes to the reforms. I think, Ambassador, you point to something very important. We need to rebuild or re-establish trust in institutions. And that should also be the main aim of many of these reforms. Legitimacy is extremely important. I think that it would not have the legitimacy if big states and countries are ruled out. One example again, the US, when they are no longer a member of the Human Rights Council, which of course I think most countries regret. Having said that, they still want to work very actively on human rights. I think that gives us a chance to engage them constructively, even though it's outside of the system. We have to, because we depend on the US as a major force and voice when it comes to human rights. And that has also to do with legitimacy. The organizations need to deliver. Unless they are able to deliver, they will not have trust, they will not have legitimacy. And one of the most striking things, I think, with the reforms that have been undertaken now in the UN, and I think that the Secretary General has done an impressive job in pushing reforms through. The problem is that all the countries who stood ringside cheering him along on these reforms are unwilling to pay. So the reforms risk stopping before getting out of, even start running with the reforms, because of the lack of financing. So I think countries also have to assume that responsibility that it entails, that when you reform, you also have to change the financing. One thing I think is striking in the UN system is that for every $7 we spend on repairing a conflict, for instance, we spend only $1 in preventing a conflict from happening. The human rights pillar in the UN system, which is also part of the reform, is only allocated 3% of the total resources in the UN system. And we all know how much that means to later on maybe having a conflict. So I think that we have to turn our thinking upside down a bit. And I fully agree with you in reforming the reforms as well, because they are always too slow and of course difficult to run through. So I think that I've made a lot of notes, and I think that many interesting points have been raised here, and especially from both of you and also from the audience, and I think that it's a good starting point for taking this discussion further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me bring this to a close. I think we've had a robust and deep discussion about what the international system must do in order to preserve what it has achieved. Multilateralism, of course, is not ending, but there are many challenges, and we have to kind of think about in different ways, in new ways, ways to reform them to make it happen. You know, what you said about the reforms and discussion we've had, multilateralism, I mean, of course, benefits the smaller countries the most, but somehow the big countries have to be persuaded that it also benefits them. And that's I think the key. Look, thank you very much. I think first for the keynote speech, Foreign Minister Ine Eriksen Søreide. And please join me in thanking Dr. Kantathi, His Excellency, former Foreign Minister of Thailand, Dr. Kantathi Suphamongkhon, His Excellency, former Foreign Minister of Thailand, Kasit Piromya, and most of all for sharing your time with expertise and insight, Foreign Minister of Norway, Ms. Ine Eriksen Søreide. Thank you very much.